Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. As always, I am Katie Batesman, the content director at SheCanCode, and today we're diving into the topic of becoming a developer. It's a role that we hear thrown around a lot in the tech space, but do you know exactly what it is and where to get started? Thankfully, I'm joined today by the amazing Ellora Praharaj, Director of Reliability Engineering at Stack Overflow, to share everything you need to know about what it's like to be a developer and how to start your career as one. Welcome, Ellora.
Hi, Kaylee. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for agreeing to join us today. It's going to be such a popular topic. I know a lot of our ladies do ask us about it, how to become a developer and what it actually involves. So thank you so much for coming on and suggesting such a great topic. Before we get started though, can we hear a little bit about you and your background, please?
Yeah, absolutely. My background, I kind of grew up all over the place, all over the country of India. My dad was in the military, so we used to move around every few years. I'd been interested in math and sciences from a very young age. I was that kid that would not play any sports. I would be usually in the corner with a book. I ended up going into computer engineering and my undergraduate, and then I got an opportunity to come over to the United States and do my master's over here. I was very lucky and privileged that they offered me a full tuition, which really helped because education is pretty expensive over here. And that was at SUNY Buffalo. So that's the State University of New York at Buffalo. Just a couple of months in, we had a career fair, and someone had actually encouraged me to go attend the career fair. I went up to this booth called Bloomberg, which I'd never heard of before, and just kind of had an informal chat. They called me back for an interview, and I ended up getting picked for the internship the following year.
Wow.
That was a really good experience. Yeah, for 3 months. What I really liked is that they didn't just treat you as, it wasn't a superficial role. When you were an intern, you were doing actual coding, you were actually putting stuff into production. And you got the chance to work with real people hands-on. So it was a really good experience overall. And they gave me towards the end of the internship, I interviewed again, and they offered me a full-time position at the company, which is great because I did not look anywhere else. And I was like, cool, I'm just going to go back to Bloomberg.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear though that they let you actually get involved in the job and put things into production. I know you wouldn't think that on an internship, would you? But they must be quite trusting of new talent, and I suppose that really just encouraged you to stay. As it sounds, you wanted to apply for a role.
Absolutely. Yeah, I subsequently worked there for 11.5 years, and the pattern had always been we wanted to make sure that our interns got a real world experience, and we weren't just going to give them frivolous projects. But selfishly, it made sense for the business as well, because it's like, hey, we have all these great, young folks coming in who are very eager to learn and they want to do stuff. So let's harness that energy the right way. So we would put in the appropriate guardrails, have them, buddy up with a mentor, someone who was watching over the work. We weren't just letting folks, YOLO stuff into production. But the fact that it was a real experience, like for example, the code that I wrote was still in use a few years, even after, I think maybe some of it is still in use actually, even though it's been so long, parts of it. So it's cool. It's just like, all right, that's kind of like the stuff you work on, and it stays on.
Yeah. And you said, so you got to work with young people as well. Once you were in, you were working with young people coming through internships. So you probably were thinking, that I had such value for myself when I went through this internship doing, all of this great work, that you then got to structure what that would look like.
Yep, absolutely.
Amazing.
It's a very rewarding experience as well, just having to work with folks. And the best thing is, when you talk to folks who are just still in school or just freshly getting out of school or have done other courses, you get such a diverse array of viewpoints, because it's very easy to get heads down insular in your specific job. But then you hear all of this stuff that's happening outside. It's like, oh, this is what we're teaching in universities now. Oh, this is what I learned in this cool boot camps. Yeah, that's interesting. All right. Tech is a huge, huge world.
Yes, yeah, and I suppose, and that's some of our discussion today as well. That that aha moment, I suppose, that when you get into a job and you think, oh, yeah, I didn't know it was going to be like that, or I didn't know I was going to be, learning this way, or learning all the new things. Once you get in, an internship is a great bridge for that. I had a lady on here recently who told me about her internship, and she did exactly the same thing right after the internship. She applied for the position at the company, because we were discussing, actually, it's not just the qualifications, is it, that you learn when you go for an internship? It's just the world of work, getting the politics of work and how to work with a team and how to get on with people. And an internship is a great way to just learn soft skills, as just, not just the technical coding side of things, but just the soft skills of working with people, isn't it?
Absolutely, because in a university or like a boot camp or other things, yeah, sure, they're group projects, but they are, at the end of it, they're basically college projects. You don't have to think about like all of the other aspects of, oh, what is going to happen if this stuff breaks, or oh, this is actually going to go into production. How is it going to be used in this different ways? Because you're focused on solving very narrow set of problems when you're in school or you're working on like hobby projects. Real world experience is like, oh, it's not just the coding is just one part of it. There are all of these other things that you have to consider as well. And then the fact is, being an intern, I think, is like really awesome, because it's very rosy. Like, for example, when I was an intern, they took us to the Fed Reserve in New York. So I got to see like huge amounts of gold bricks. We went to the New York Stock Exchange. We saw like I forget the company, unfortunately, but we saw like the company ring the bell. So these are the cool parts as well. It's like we want to make sure that the interns, like, and it's not just true of Bloomberg, I think across the company, even here at Stack, it's the same thing. It's like we want to make sure interns have a really rich, fulfilling experience, because we want to expose them to like all of the things that can happen at work. And the big thing is that real world experience of like, yep, this is how you operate within a team. Here, you're going to have like structure, because we need structure in a company, period. There has to be a way of working. So what does that look like? Here are the guardrails within which you operate. And then the other thing is, as an intern, the advantage is no one really expects you to know everything. So I played the noob card. It's like, oh, what is this? What does that do? And everyone was super helpful. Like, when you're an intern, it's like, it's almost like everyone views you as this person. Oh, I really want to help this person develop in the career. But yeah, I think overall in tech companies in general, like the internship position is taken seriously. It's not something considered, oh, go get coffee for me, or I've heard of the stories I've seen on sitcoms and stuff like that. That is not the case in tech companies.
Yes. How many times have we heard, just doing, somebody sitting at the shredder, or I don't even know if companies still have photocopiers, but that used to be the job of just, the intern, as you said, getting coffee. But yeah, it's a great way just to figure out, who's a really good talent, and to bring in great talent and to keep them. As you said, you stayed for 11 and a half years. So they must have done something right. On that note then, what is your day-to-day life like now? Can you give us an insight into what your role is like?
So my title is Director of Reliability Engineering. That means that all of the site reliability engineers and the database reliability engineers at Stack report up into me. SRE is something that was coined by Google in the late 2000s. And it essentially focuses on applying a software approach to DevOps. The focus is not just on making sure that your application works or the features are complete. It's really focused on making sure that the applications are reliable, that they're scalable. If stuff happens in the background, you're still able to service your clients. We think about, SRE mindset is a little different. We really think about performance numbers, uptime, privacy, security. We want to make sure that everything is as secure as possible. And then applying automation to every part of the workflow. The SRE, well, one of the things that we're very fond of saying is, how can we automate ourselves out of our current jobs? It's not because well, we're lazy, sure, but it's also because we want to find other cool stuff to do, not just working on manual toil.
Yes, making room to do other things. Yes, I've heard that so many times in tech when people get really panicked about certain jobs that are moving out. There's always stories, aren't there, headlines about, CTOs are angry because something's come in and it's made their job easier and it's going to take over. AI, for instance, is all, the headlines always say that. But you're absolutely right. It's just finding the time to do other things.
Yep. And SRE, the DevOps mindset has a very heavy focus on that. It's like, how do we use the right tools to solve this? How do we make sure that we get the computers to do our work for us, the automation part? Let's, it's a very, there's an acronym that we're very fond of saying as well, DRY, don't repeat yourself. It's like, you have to do the same thing again manually twice? No. Just figure out how to automate it.
Right.
So basically what my teams are responsible for are the underlying infrastructure that's across all of Stack Overflow. We do have physical data centers as well as a significant presence in cloud. We leverage Microsoft Azure. And at the end of the day, whether it's a physical machine or it's like a container that you're deploying an application into, there's still the notion of compute infrastructure and how to do that management layer. So that's what my teams are responsible for. My team's also responsible for the business offering that we have. There's Stack Overflow for Teams. There's multiple different tiers there, and the more you pay us, the better service you get, and the more features you get, as is common with most SaaS products. My teams are responsible for making sure that the public websites stay up and running. StackOverflow.com. Very surprisingly, but I guess it really shouldn't surprise me given the current geopolitical and economic climate. People love DDoSing a free community site. It's like, if I ever find one of them, I'm going to tar and feather them, seriously. But it's been an arms race for us, and we've had to do a huge amount of work on our side. And again, that's one of the things that my team's been responsible for, making sure that the site stays up, because anytime Stack Overflow goes down, we get a bunch of memes and tweets on Twitter, and everyone's like, well, it's time to go home. It's like, come on. All right, we get it. We're working on
quite a responsibility.
So that's the public site aspect of it. It's like making sure that the site stays up, it's stable, because the volume of traffic we deal with is pretty high.
Yeah.
The SaaS offering that we have for, business and enterprise customers is a little different, because the notion there is it has to be something that's an isolated thing for folks that we're managing. And yeah, the load isn't anywhere near what our public sites are, but there are other concerns that we have to be worried about. Like, for example, okay, how do we manage to make sure that the uptime requirements are met, that, if all of their integrations and stuff work, and each instance is slightly different. So depending on who the target customer is, whether it's like an enterprise client versus a public site user, the reliability, scalability aspects can differ, but those are all something that my team manages. So my day-to-day, I know this is a very long-winded way of coming to my day-to-day, but my day-to-day is spent—
No, this is exactly what I know the listeners are going to want to hear.
Yeah, my day-to-day these days is spending a lot of time essentially focused on how do I enable and empower my teams to do the things that they're trying to do. A big part of my job is essentially setting the strategy and the vision. And ever since I joined, I think my team members are tired of me saying this, but I've been harping on and on about automation. I've been harping on and on about self-service. Look, we don't want to continue doing all of these things manually. How do we enable our partners on the application teams to be able to do the things that we are currently doing for them because they don't have the necessary tooling? How do we bridge that gap? It might be easier to give an example, actually. So for example, application teams generally are in the business of all right, I'll write some code, I'll make sure that it works locally, and then someone else is going to deploy it. That someone else usually falls on the DevOps or the SRE teams. What I want us to do, and what we're starting to do as well, is, all right, how do we bridge that gap? Okay. How do we provide enough infrastructure and tooling to the application team so that they are able to build their applications themselves? They're able to do the deployment themselves to, stage environments like, all right, let's start with development, make sure we have automated testing. Oh, all that looks good. Move it to UAT, then move it to production. cool, now that we're in production, let's make sure we have the right visibility into what the systems are doing. Do we have the right metrics? Do we have the right traces? Do we have the right logging and all of those things in place? And all of that requires, a platform. So my teams have focused more on providing that platform so that we can essentially enable and empower our application team counterparts to be able to self-service their needs. Like they don't need to reach out to us and say, hey, can you tell me what is going on this machine and these logs? Like, here's a dashboard. Go, you can configure stuff yourself and look things up yourself. And that just reduces the friction and enables overall everybody to go faster. Because no one wants to wait and hear back from someone. It's like, can you give me a list of this stuff which I don't have access to? It's just, it's ridiculous.
Yes.
So yeah, a big part of my day is spent also focused on like, okay, how do we make sure that the things that we're doing are pushing us in that direction?
I don't think a lot of listeners joining us today would know that when you want to become a developer, that there are so many skills involved in that. I think there is that stereotype that you're just, you need the techie qualifications, and I wanted to ask you a bit, about the types of skills and qualifications that you think are important, but actually it's not just that. From what you're saying, it's being able to communicate with lots of different teams and being able to feed back to each other. That's far more than just technical skills, isn't it?
Absolutely. Something we're fond of saying here is also the coding is just a small part of the job.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really like the way it works, and I'm drawing on my own personal experience, because when I started in my career, I started as an individual contributor. I was coding very heads down. I was given like specific projects. It's like, here, this is the narrow problem you're trying to solve, go code it. And there's some interaction that I have with other folks, because it's like, all right, am I doing this the right way? Can you review my code? Can you help me test this stuff out and make sure that everything looks fine? So in those cases, you tend to be very heads down. But if you want to grow and if you want to like learn more and expand your knowledge, you have to start looking beyond. And that cannot be achieved by just being heads down on a specific piece of code. That involves a lot of discussions. I'm fond of saying software engineering is more of an art than a science, because there's many different ways of solving the same problem, and you're trying to always find, this is going to sound so silly, but you're trying to always find the least worst way of solving certain problems, because it's a lot of negotiating. It's like, what are the trade-offs there? There's constantly things, because and then there's another famous thing in software engineering. There's speed, quality, and time. So if you want high quality, well, you have to either sacrifice time, it's going to take longer, or you throw a lot of money at the problem. So basically, it's like that triangle you have to pick two. And that means a lot of trade-offs. It's like, okay, where's the largest ROI and stuff like that? No, sorry, I'm rambling. I'm getting back to the point is, when you start growing in your career, you start realizing that if you want to work on like cool projects, or you want to do something that's out of your comfort zone, or you want to like learn a different language or understand an unfamiliar system, you can't just be heads down in the coding. You really have to be able to communicate that and work effectively with people.
I love the fact you called it an art as well, that it's not just that heads down, that you really it is an art form. It's not just a string of code and that's it. I think a lot of us, we don't tend to think as tech as creative or as an art form, but you're absolutely right, those that work in it, I've heard that before, people refer to it as an art.
Yeah, no, you have to be very creative in solving problems in tech. It doesn't look like it on the face of it, but there's always those underlying trade-offs, and that's something that also comes with like experience and maturity. Or like as you're going out of like just solving those narrow problems and trying to learn more, you realize, oh, there's all of these other things to consider as well. One thing I really look for, like when I'm hiring people, I've done, I don't know, like hundreds of interviews at this point, at all different levels, and I've been on the side of interviewing when I was an individual contributor, interviewing my peers. I've interviewed as a hiring manager. I've interviewed as a manager that's helping out other teams, stuff like that. For me, the big thing I look for is, does the person have the right attitude? Because if someone is coming in with a very, oh, this is the only thing I like, and this is the only thing I'm going to work on, that's a huge red flag for me. It's like, okay, maybe we can figure out like a very narrow place for that person, but they're not going to grow.
Yeah.
If a person comes in, they're like, oh, I really want to, like, these are the things that I'm interested in. I want to continue working in these, but I'm open to learning these other kinds of things. And you just kind of like get that sense. Again, this is something that I've learned from experience, like having done so many interviews, but you get a sense for like when you know that that person really is eager to learn and do more stuff and understand and like really help collaborate with the teams and make sure that the overall projects are a success. And those are the folks that are the most successful in my experience.
Yeah, they might not necessarily have all the qualifications that the job was asking for, but they'll get there. As you said, at least they've got the attitude to learn. In terms of qualifications, though, are there any that you think are important to have? Is it just having that computer science degree, or do you look for other things along the way? Because everybody takes different career paths, don't they?
It really depends on the specific role, but in terms of like a pure coding role, I've hired people that have had like a math background or a physics background. I've even hired folks that have had a non-STEM background, but they took essentially coding classes on the side. And I've worked with a couple of folks they've been fantastic. Again, the right attitude and that willingness to learn really helped them in the career. In terms of like specific skills and qualifications, I came from a very traditional, computer engineering background, did a lot of data structures, algorithms, fundamentals, and stuff like that. I still believe that anyone that's trying to do a career in tech should have a strong grasp of what those fundamentals are. And this isn't something you necessarily need to go to university. There's a lot of online resources and things like that that can help you learn those things. But there has to be a basic understanding of like, well, how do computers work? How does memory management work? Oh, what is this thing that we call the compiler? How does the OS work? There have to be like a base understanding of those fundamentals, because once you have a strong understanding of the fundamentals, you can really figure out how to build the layers on top of it. In terms of programming languages, like languages are literally a dime a dozen. My first language that I learned was C, which is pretty esoteric. It's not really used much anymore unless people are doing like embedded systems or like ultra low latency stuff. Even so, like C is kind of falling out of fashion, out of favor, I would say. And there are so many different languages now, like the most popular ones, Python, Rust. So languages keep evolving, but again, having that base understanding, like learning one language well and understanding the fundamentals again around like, okay, how does memory allocation work? How does like, if you're learning like an object-oriented language, or if you're learning a functional language, learning that structure really helps, because those will help you translate into other languages as well. Most folks I know are polyglot, like, people know more than one programming language. I myself had to learn like Perl and Fortran when I first joined Bloomberg, and I was like, what the hell is this? But that was the requirement that the business had. But because I had that background in like, I'd done C, I'd done C++, it was like, oh, okay, I can easily translate these concepts that I know in this language over to this language. So yeah, honestly, like I wouldn't be super fussed about like, oh, you have to know this language. For example, like the people I've hired over the years, even if they didn't necessarily have like the languages that we were working on, but they had a working knowledge of like other languages and they were willing to learn the stuff that we required, they were successful.
Yeah. And is there anything that, they could put on their CV to stand out to potential employers? I suppose that's, as you're saying, that's not actually just programming languages. That could just be extra projects that you're working on or extra things that you're doing to stand out as somebody that's got a great attitude.
Yeah, in terms of like CV, the thing that I look for is, I'm just going to go off of what like are the certain things that I watch out for. If it reads like a list of buzzwords, that's a giant red flag. If it's like 10 pages long, that's a red flag. I can't tell you how many times I've read resumes that just keep on rambling and talking about, involved with blah, 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 but not really giving me a sense of like, well, what exactly was your role? What did you work on? Those are the kinds of things that I look for. What makes a CV stand out to me is a very concise clear and simple explanation of, well, this was the project, this was what I did on it, this was my role. And if there were any particular things that, like, for example, oh, I called out that XYZ was wrong, or I suggested something and this is what got implemented. What I'm looking for is like that, again, that attitude showing through on the CV. It's like, oh, I not only had an idea, but I was also able to like successfully advocate for it to get done, pushing stuff to execution.
Yes.
Yeah, so those really are the things that I look for. If it's like a word salad or just a long list of laundry list of qualifications, yeah, those are the ones I end up passing over.
Yes, I completely agree. You need to see somebody that's actually done something, and what it actually turned out like, or just how they worked within a team. On that though, should aspiring developers, should they be creating a coding portfolio to go with their CV? Is that something you should always be mindful of throughout your career?
So there's a lot of differing opinions on this. Personally, for me, I don't really care. Because I'm going to look for a relevant experience. Now, if this is someone who's fresh out of school and doesn't have like a lot of industry experience, then by all means, yes, it makes sense. Like it's not necessarily that you have to have like an explicit coding portfolio, but you should be able to talk to me about projects that you've done, that you've worked on, whether they're college projects or your side projects. I'm not, I'm not necessarily going to go on GitHub and like check out your code and see if stuff works and things like that. I would much rather have the person talk me through, their thought process, the challenges that they faced, and how they solve certain problems.
Yes, I suppose as well, though, that also applies, because I wanted to ask you about experience next. Is it necessary? And like you said, if it's somebody that's applying as a graduate and they haven't got a lot of experience, then fair enough. But we have a lot of ladies on our podcasts and on our live events that are transitioning later in their career into a career in technology, and so they don't have that experience as yet. And we always get asked, how do you apply for a job if you don't have the experience? And actually, a lot of those ladies, it suddenly dawns on them that they've been in work 10 to 15 years, and even though they might be a junior in tech or whatever it is they're applying for, they've got heaps of experience just in the workplace. And by the sounds of it, actually that is far more relevant than just being able to show that you can code and that code works. I'm sure if somebody come to you and said, I've worked on a project at a different company, it might not be a tech project, but this is how we overcome those challenges. Surely that's something as well that you'd be really interested in hearing about.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, that's the real world experience that, no university or bootcamp can set you up for. That's a learned thing. And people who have that experience and are transitioning, like, mad props to them. It's like, you spend 10, 15 years in a specific career and then you've decided to pivot. It's like, that is very, very impressive. And like I said, like, mad props to them. They have that wealth of real world experience behind them, so they can bring different viewpoints to the table. And then in terms of like the coding part, again, like I said, like, these are technical skills. You can learn them, you can pick them up. You start with like certain projects, and then as you get more comfortable, you start gaining more and more experience. I mean, in terms of like coding experience for someone that's pivoting, I would say don't fuss too much about it. Again, focus on like what you've learned, because I would imagine that folks are either taking courses, going to maybe a formal university or a boot camp, whatever, and they're sharpening up their technical skills. Focus on doing projects within that scope. Focus on projects that can showcase your abilities and things that you can talk to. It's all, like, for example, when I've interviewed like a fresh grad or, students who are still in college, my question to them is like, all right, tell me about some of the projects that you've worked on. Explain to me what the problem was. What were you trying to solve? Give me a thought process behind it. And that still translates even for folks who are transitioning later, because it's really like looking at that thought process and understanding, okay, do they understand what they're trying to solve, or are they just like checking off a box on their assignment?
Yes, exactly. And I suppose so I wanted to ask you a little bit about interviewing. I was going to say, do you get that vibe from some people as well during an interview where you just think you're just going through the motions, you're just ticking off, as you said, that you see on CVs, buzzwords probably flying everywhere. Do you have any tips for interviewing? Any sort of red flags that you see and you think, no, if I could get off this call quick, I would?
Well, yeah, I'm trying, because I've done like a bunch of, I've done a lot of interviews in real life as well as over, video conference. The thing that comes across to me is, again, it's just if I'm not fussed if the person is anxious, like interviewing is hard.
Yeah.
But if the person is someone who's coming off as like brusque and doesn't really want to be there, that's like obviously a huge red flag, right?
Yeah.
So if you're doing an interview, make sure that you're actually invested in it and that, you're not wasting your time and the interviewer's time. Because I've had experiences like that. So that's like the extremes. Like, let's start with that baseline. Make sure that you want to be there. I would say, like, again, a lot of people get anxious during the interviews. Just take a deep breath, relax. This isn't like a life or death thing. And the other person on the other end doesn't really know your level experience. They don't know anything about you. That's why they're having that interview and they want to like really understand and get to know you better. Interviewers, like the big part of the job of the interviewer is making sure that we're setting the interviewee at ease. So we're able to like understand where they're coming from. If someone like, and again, like with the hundreds of interviews I've done, like I've sat in some interviews where my co-interviewer was like rather rude and brusque, and it's like, that's just not a recipe for success.
That person's probably thinking, I don't think I want to work for you, or
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, for interviewing, like really, I would say just be honest, be clear. Like there's no need to make stuff up, because if you're lying, like it will show, unless you're very, very, very good at making stuff up. It'll show through. I can't tell you how many times I've had like folks tell me, oh yeah, I'm like a 10 in C++. And then I start asking them like some targeted questions. Like, so how would you figure out, this memory allocation? How would you deal with this pointer? And they just completely bomb. It's like, yeah, of course, if you're going to tell me that you're an expert, I'm going to ask you those questions. So
yeah,
don't make shit up. Because interviewers, especially seasoned interviewers, will see right through you. It's okay to not know everything. I personally, if someone tells me that, oh, actually, I've never had to deal with this, or I don't know this, instead of trying to make something up, I would much prefer, again, that honest. It's like, you don't have to know anything. That shows me that you're willing to acknowledge that you don't necessarily know everything and that you want to learn. So for me, like those are the things that really stand out as a candidate, because it's like, okay, yeah, this person has the right attitude, they're willing to learn, and they're not afraid to acknowledge that they don't know everything. Again, an interview process can be like, it can be a little tense, and you want to show your best, you want to put your best foot forward, stuff like that, but just be honest, acknowledge what you know, acknowledge what you don't know. And most interviewers, again, the good interviewers, right? Like, it's like, we're not going to keep dragging you over. Oh, you don't know this? Like, why don't you know this? And let me keep asking you questions about that. No, we always pivot to asking you stuff that you're familiar with, because look, at the end of the day, we're trying to figure out what your thought process is, not whether or not you know some obscure esoteric syntax. Hey, I can always search for that. I can do a Google search.
Yes, I've been in those interviews. Where you just think somebody's just grilling me on something. You think this isn't going to go well. In terms of career progression, what does that look like in the industry? I mean, it moves incredibly fast. I'm assuming there's a wide range of directions that you could take. What do you think it looks like for most developers, though?
It really depends on the individual and the path that they want to choose. I know folks who've been in the industry for 40 years, 40, maybe actually, maybe not 40, 30 years, who have chosen to remain technical the entire time. And they've essentially progressed from, being, starting off as a junior early in the career to being like a senior, staff. There's different roles. And again, depending on the company, like, whether the company has like a principal role or an architect role, whatever. but there is that technical path. So if folks want to stay just, yeah, all I want to do is I want to focus on coding. I want to like make sure that I'm building out the best systems that I can. That is an option. Doesn't mean that you're not going to talk to any people. No, collaboration and communication is still key. Like all the soft skills still remain, but it allows someone to essentially spend like, a majority of their time focused on coding and building stuff out. If folks want to go into management, that is another career path. That's the path I ended up on kind of a little unwillingly. Actually, been a few years into my career at Bloomberg, we had like a reorg of my group. And my manager approached me and said, oh, I want you to take over this team that I want focused on infrastructure across the multiple teams because we were duplicating stuff. And I just freaked out and was like, oh, no, I don't think I can be a team lead. And then he said, okay, fine. How about this? So sneaky. It's like, why don't you help, with the vision and focus on the infrastructure and like mentor other people, but you don't have to officially be like a team lead. I was like, cool. Yeah, that sounds easier. That sounds nicer. A year later, I realized I was doing all of the things. So I took the title.
And then you were just meant for it and suddenly thought, actually, I hadn't even thought of myself as a team lead. Maybe that's what I was doing.
Yeah, it ended up working out. And then like a few years later, I found out that I was still very hands-on because it was a very small, it was a small group, like it was just like 5 of us. I was focused on like doing a lot of hands-on coding and stuff like that. But then as I started growing the career, I realized that, and I made the classic mistake of like, this is a complete segue, but I made the classic mistake of like, oh, new manager, I have to be responsible for everything. So I tried to do everything.
Yeah.
And well, that's really bad for me personally. And it's even worse for my team because I'm taking opportunities away from them and not spending enough time focused on them and their career growth. So yes. I learned that lesson the hard way.
Heard that a lot, how to delegate. And also you said before about when you take an internship, nobody expects you to know everything. And I've been told by lots of ladies on this podcast that as soon as you step into a leadership position, they have this thought, everybody expects me to know everything and I need to know everything. And you're absolutely right. You're not, you have a whole team there. But I've heard it so often that it takes a little while to settle into your leadership style. And to find your way.
Yep, it took me a couple of years to understand that. You just cannot know everything, and there's an entire team behind you. That is what you have to rely on. But yeah, so the manager path is available as well. Like you can still be technical. Like I still read code. I'm a director now. I don't really code anymore, but I can read PRs. I can point out issues. I can like if my teams are like making infrastructure decisions, I will step in and like ask them. Now, I'm not like trying to be prescriptive or say, this is how you must do it because this is how I know I would do it. But it's like really asking them leading questions, like, what are the problems you're trying to solve? Why don't you give me the different scenarios? And as engineers, we love bike shedding. Like we will argue and argue and argue if needed till time immemorial on like the specifics of certain solutions. And a big part of my role there is like stepping in, having the technical knowledge of like, okay, yeah, you know what? We need to end this discussion because we're not moving anywhere. Let's pick this approach and go with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of career progression, sorry, that was a segue. But coming back, yeah, you can stay completely technical if you want. You can move into people management if you want. There's also all sorts of other roles, like, if you want to be more focused on agile, for example, there's definitely so some companies have like the roles where they're like, cool, you can help out as a scrum lead while also being someone who's technical. So that allows people to use like the collaborative skills, but still at an individual contributor level. If folks want to move more into like architecture and systems design, those are also there. I know of some folks, and this is totally a plug. I know of some folks who started off as application developers and then they moved into the SRE role. And I was one of them because my background had been a lot of application development, and sure, it was focused on infrastructure, but it wasn't really SRE. I ended up creating the first SRE team for my group back in 2015, and that was a great experience. And, right now, platform, SRE, all of these things are like very, very much in demand because companies are looking to figure out like, okay, how do we do automation? How do we become more efficient? And these are skill sets that are very much in demand. So it
Yes.
really depends on the individual person and like the particular opportunities that they have at the place that they're in. But don't let that be a ceiling because there's other companies out there too.
Yes, I completely agree. And for those listeners who are thinking about, a career as a developer and then they're not quite sure where to get started or what to do you have any final advice for those listeners or anything that you wish you had been told when you got started?
Well, I wish someone had told me that I needed to improve my communication skills when I started. When I first started, like, early in my career, I was very heads down and I would just be stuck trying to solve problems on my own. And you don't have to suffer through that. You can ask for help. It's perfectly okay. In terms of folks who are thinking about, well, but I've already alluded to this before, but just make sure that you have a firm understanding of the fundamentals. Like, as long as you have an understanding of, this is so like, this is going to sound very, very simplified, but it's like, how do computers work? Like, what goes into it? How do these applications work? That's important.
Yeah.
Other big piece of advice that I would say is make sure to keep up, like do a lot of reading. There's a lot of online resources out there. There's some fantastic authors. There's a lot of blog posts. Make sure that you read so you don't end up becoming insular in your particular role. You want to be able to hear other viewpoints. You don't want to be in an echo chamber because tech is constantly evolving and there's a lot of changes happening. It doesn't mean that you have to follow the other articles and all, like you don't have to necessarily keep up with all of the buzzwords and stuff like that. Obviously, there's that layer of filtering out, but keep up with what the rest of the industry is up to, especially in terms of standards, industry best practices, because those are the things that are overall pushing the needle on tech.
Yeah, I suppose that's not just trying to get your first role, that's actually throughout your entire career to always keep learning and to be of that mindset.
Absolutely.
Thank you to Ellora so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us and for sharing your insights. Thank you so much.
Really, this was a lot of fun.
Good, thank you. It's flown by and we could talk all afternoon about it. And to everybody listening, as always, thank you for joining us and we hope to see you again next time.